and welcome to episode 4 of This Academic Life. So it's Saturday, October 1st, and I am sitting here with a large mug of coffee. It's a warp speed Star Trek mug because I'm getting ready for a weekend of edits. Probably some late nights, and I don't get to go out this weekend because I need to get this application done and ready to hand in on Monday. What I wanted to talk about today is the recurrence, at least for me, of a very common academic affliction. It tends to strike academics especially during proposal season when they're putting together their prospectus or when they're receiving feedback or edits. Its symptoms can include nausea, an upset stomach, severe anxiety, insomnia, and it is the infamous imposter syndrome. Very common, also affects older academics, doesn't tend to go away, the prognosis is not generally very good, but it's nevertheless something that's very common. Whether you have heard the term imposter syndrome or not, you probably know the feeling of this panic and this anxiety that what if they accepted the wrong person and they didn't check their transcripts properly and, they haven't quite figured me out, but I know that one day they will. When I write my final paper, they'll figure it out that I'm not supposed to be here. Or when I write my prospectus, they'll know that I'm actually not very smart and I kind of fudged my way into this discipline. It sounds a little bit more dramatic, obviously, the way that I've put it, but it's nevertheless something quite serious because it affects our self-esteem, and as I did mention, it actually does manifest itself in a lot of physical ailments and a lot of emotional and mental discomfort. Now, how does the imposter syndrome apply in my current situation? I'm writing a proposal. It's for a grant application or a scholarship, but it's the same kind of proposal that I'll be using when I submit my rationale for my qualifying papers, for my comprehensive exams. And in some ways, it's a little bit similar to when you write a prospectus or an abstract, or even a conference proposal. You're saying what you're hoping to accomplish, what methodology you're going to be using, and most importantly, what contribution you're going to be making to your field. Now, these kinds of proposals usually require a certain level of assertiveness, because selling it through assertiveness is kind of part of the whole game. If you don't believe in your research, then other people won't either. But you have to put the cart before the horse, in that when you're a student, especially when you don't necessarily have 15 or 20 years of experience in the field, and therefore you haven't done 15 to 20 years of reading and research in the field, you have to pretend that you know what you're talking about. And that can cause a lot of anxiety. I study Canadian literature, and it's a discipline that I kind of fell into accidentally a couple years ago when I took a course to basically stick in my schedule because it worked better for me, and it happened to be Canadian literature. Fell in love with the discipline, took all the Canadian literature courses in the department, took exchange courses in Canadian literature, and am absolutely in love with it. I've taught Canadian literature twice now, and I'm trying to immerse myself in it as much as possible. Unfortunately, as with any national literature, or as with any field or discipline, it's very, very broad. If you're a historian, you're not going to study all of history. You might focus on Roman history or modern British history or whatever. And when you're a student, you have to go through a long process of learning about it, not just the events or the key pieces of literature or texts, but also what critics are saying about it, what other researchers are doing, and so you have to build a familiarity with the field. And along with building familiarity, as with learning how to ride a bike or learning how to skate, the more familiarity that you build, the more confident that you become, because you have prior experience to base your future experience on. Imposter syndrome, however, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily go away. There are always scholars who are more experienced, who have been working in the field for 30, 40, 50 years in some cases, and we're always striving to be that kind of person, to have that much experience. I wonder, and I'm trying to think through, if there are any ways that we can combat the imposter syndrome. And maybe a way of thinking about it is that we're always students. Whether we finish our PhDs and go on to become professors, or if we're in our master's program, or if we're in even an undergraduate program, that we should always consider ourselves students. That's not to say that we shouldn't recognize our areas of expertise, or acknowledge that we are familiar with a field, or that we can talk about it confidently. But the idea of being a student is a really wonderful one because it doesn't breed this sort of stasis and complacency that can come when people think that they've mastered a discipline. There are some academics out there who believe that they have. They may not necessarily do much research anymore, they may not publish anymore, they may not go to a lot of conferences anymore. They acknowledge that the training that they received at a certain point was sufficient, and that will do for the next however many years that they're teaching. I, however, would like to believe that I'm never going to know it all. And it's actually a gift when I receive feedback, especially from these sacred elders in my discipline, as I like to think of them as, regarding where I can make small changes, regarding what theoretical frameworks might actually be better to use in this case. Sometimes when people point out where you lack expertise, it can feel pretty devastating, like you should have known it. You should have known it and you shouldn't have made this mistake, and how stupid could you have been? I got a comment on my proposal when I actually mentioned an author that was a little bit problematic, and I was using his work to prove a point about race and writing in Canada, and not having a lot of familiarity with this author in particular, or the legacy that he's sort of left, or the people that he's working with or working against. I didn't really consider it as deeply as I might have if I had more experience. So that was pointed out to me, and it was pointed out incredibly gently that, I think what you're trying to say is, or maybe you're thinking about these issues, but you don't know quite how to frame them or how to articulate them yet. So it's really nice when you get positive and gentle feedback, and you use that feedback to say, wow, it's amazing that I didn't know this, and it'll be so exciting to pursue this different avenue of research, etc. So imposter syndrome is something that I think takes a lot of mental discipline to catch and to deal with, because left untreated, it quickly gets out of control. And I've seen it with friends that they simply can't manage to get that sense of inadequacy under control. And so they also don't delight in their accomplishments. They might present a paper at a conference and talk about how stupid they thought it was, or they publish an article and they think, well, it wasn't really that great, it wasn't a great journal, or it wasn't that innovative, or whatever. So imposter syndrome also not only causes distress, but it also prevents you from taking pride in your accomplishments, and you should at each stage of the journey, whether you're publishing your first paper, giving your first conference paper, making your first grant application, or when you publish your dissertation. A lot of times, and this is happening when people sometimes go back to their work because they think, oh, I might be able to use something that I wrote a few years ago, and they realize, oh my goodness, this was maybe not bad, and I think that we should refrain from using those qualifiers, but maybe a little bit naive, or sort of missing out on some key points. And it's really interesting to go back to your work and say, wow, I know so much more now. It would be really interesting to revise that work. So when you're going through the process of editing these works, and when you're also going through the process of proposing new work, remember that these committees don't expect you to be experts. Otherwise, they would not be giving you the funding to continue being a student and to be doing the research so that you can get to that point. Same goes for when you finish your PhD and when you move out into the world. A lot of people think that the PhD is the end point sometimes, or at least it's portrayed as the end point or the capstone of your career, but really it's just a preliminary intervention. And even when people go on to publish their first book, which is generally a revision of their dissertation, the project can change immensely from that point because you learn more. And if we're not continually learning, if we're not continually realizing that we need to always read more, always interact more, then that's where learning stops, and that's where complacency begins. So imposter syndrome is not necessarily bad. It can teach us a lot of things. It can teach us to keep our egos in check and to keep our excitement about learning going. But if we can try, and I include myself in this we because I struggle with it at times as well, to keep that sense of despair in check and to realize that you're in a process, that this is a experiential and long-term experience in academia. So I hope that you are all doing well and that you are taking care of yourselves as well as you go through your various academic processes. And I will check in probably in a few days. I have some stuff about teaching that I want to address in my next video. Alright, so take care guys. Bye!